Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 4 of Series 7. The question for this evening is, to what extent has the concept of value been overlooked and neglected? Reading again for this evening is from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 2. So we have recently discussed how consciousness has been overlooked and neglected. This is relevant for us this evening because value also seems to have been overlooked and neglected for similar reasons. That is, value is a constituent of consciousness that shares some of the characteristics of consciousness. That is, value is immaterial and, like consciousness, can be a contentious concept. That is, it is sometimes claimed that consciousness, like value, doesn't really exist. For example, value only consists in values like wanting, loving and hating, or beauty, truth and knowledge. Similarly, there is no pure consciousness, but only conscious states like cognition, affect and volition. I agree, and even personal identity is just an aspect of consciousness, not a supposed essence. But consciousness is bound together with its constituents, aided by personal identity in a synthetic unity through space and time. So there is no such thing as pure consciousness, pure value, or even pure cognition. But that's no reason not to use the general or collective concept of value or the idea of value states. And we can just as well talk about cognitive states or affect states in a similar way. But more importantly, the neglect or apprehension of value is crucial in the view that I put forward elsewhere. That is, problems of human existence can only be properly posed in terms of consciousness and value, and that these should be resolved in and through the pursuit of certain value states. These are the will to value, the value of value, leading to a sufficiency of value. I previously qualified and argued this view and won't be doing again this evening. The above clarifies a confusion over the difference between the general concept of value and particular values. Yet another known problem that encourages neglect and confusion about value is the diversity of values. That is, so many different value states like desire, love, hate, morals, aesthetics and bias are called values. The question is, are these different states all masquerading as one concept, that is, value? Some clarification could be found with the classification of motivational, affective and perspectival values. Motivational or volitional or moral values are ethical principles and reasons for action. Moral and motivational values are comparable and are universally recognized as particular kinds of value. Yet these kinds of values can have different degrees of volitional content. Experiential or affective values are those like love, hate, desire, guilt, shame, disgust and pity. But affective values aren't often described as such, adding to the suspicion of a neglect of value. Perspectival or cognitive values apply to different perspectives like value-laden facts and bias. The notion of perspectival values is widely used by philosophers such as Bernard Williams and Thomas Nagel. Yet this classification can include numerical values and truth values of the logically true or false. But perspectival values don't even appear to have the subjective experiential content that seems essential to value. And numerical and truth values only seem to be values analogously. They seem to be better described as quantification or quantity, not the quality applicable to value. However, with the exception of numerical and truth values, some commonalities can be found. These are properties like subjectivity, preference, and quality. Again, there is no time to explicate these properties this evening, but we are obliged to first define the concept of value that I am claiming has been neglected and overlooked. Yet this has already begun above with motivational, affective and perspectival values, as well as by mentioning the properties of subjectivity, preference and quality. Yet there are many other ways in which value can be defined, such as by intrinsic, attributed or instrumental value. But one way which also indicates the neglect of value is John Mackie's argument against objective values. Objective here means the status of ontologically substantive objects, not normativity or universality. Mackie gives three main arguments to support his view that there are no objective values. 1. The direction of dependence is mistakenly reversed by making the desire depend upon the goodness. 2. His argument from queerness is that objective values would have an untenable quasi-objective status. 3. He points to the psychological propensity of the mind to spread itself on external objects, also noted by others like Freud. Mackie's point that the mind spreads itself and its attributes like value onto the world is another explanation of neglect. I previously presented Feuerbach's projection theory of religion as a misapprehension of consciousness. Yet because religious ideas like God also represent the believer's highest values, it is also a misrepresentation of value. And Hume and Freud and others have also used the idea of projection as misapprehension. To explain Mackie's second argument from queerness, it is saying that objective values would be anomalous. This is because objective entities can't have the subjective properties that value must have. These will be disparate kinds of things, like numbers can't have the properties of colour. Further to his argument from queerness, Mackie writes that if there were objective values, then they would be entities or qualities or relations of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. I agree, because values like wanting and liking cannot exist independently of a conscious being. Yet many religious and philosophical thinkers appeal to objective values quite straightforwardly. Such include Iris Murdoch, Susan Wolfe, Robert Nozick and Ronald Dworkin. But in my view, such disagreements indicate a lack of understanding, if not neglect of value. But a stronger argument for the neglect of value can be found in a history of science. Auguste Comte, 1798 to 1857, is the founder of positivism, that only hard scientific facts count. He saw progressive advances from theology and metaphysics to a final stage of positive facts. This view influenced the subsequent logical positivism of the Vienna Circle and A.J. Ayer. The Vienna Circle and Rudolf Carnap dismissed the significance of value. They held that value judgments are senseless because they lack cognitive content. A.J. Ayer endorsed logical positivism through his principle of verification. That is, a proposition is only meaningful if it is subject to verification as either true or false. And his emotivist theory of ethics dismissed values as just emotions like laughing or crying. On this view, religious, ethical, poetic, intuitive, mythical and value judgments are disregarded as meaningless. Ayer himself and others later rejected this view as excessive, but it nevertheless influenced philosophy. It does this because analytic philosophy continues to emphasize language, logic, precision and verification. And non-cognitive concerns about affect, will and value, meaning and purpose are given less attention. This neglect of value is also evident in the cognitive, non-cognitive classification widely used in analytic philosophy. This is a cognitively biased classification that negatively defines non-cognitive mental states and omits values. To be more specific and more inclusive, we need to add the further three classifications of affect, will and value to the classification. But surprisingly, as a descriptive method, phenomenology has also tended to overlook and neglect value. And in this way, phenomenology shares an epistemological bias with the whole of Western philosophy. Existentialists such as Kierkegaard and Nietzsche may be exceptions to this bias, and likewise Oriental perspectives and religion. But they have another set of problems to deal with. The founder of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, initially wanted phenomenology to be a new objective science. Yet Husserl wanted to bracket out the natural understanding of the physical and social sciences. He wanted to obtain a presuppositionless, or what we can call a value-free grasp of consciousness. But most phenomenologists like Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty thought this wasn't possible. But Heidegger and other phenomenologists also had an ambivalent attitude towards value. Heidegger cites care as the being of Dasein, and Sartre writes that the being of the self is value. Care might be taken as a mode of value, similarly emphasized by Sartre. But Heidegger rejects explanations of care in terms of value as an aspect of the will. He repudiates such and rejects, I quote, any attempts to trace it back to special acts or drives like willing and wishing or urge and addiction, and we can add an implied value. This is so because he explicitly talks about thinking against values, and he explains that precisely through the characterization of something as a value, what is so value is robbed of its worth. Heidegger goes on to say that this is because every valuing, even where it values positively, is a subjectivization. It does not let beings be. Heidegger seems to want to exclude care and being from a Hume hierarchy of values. He becomes more explicit when he writes, I quote, "When one proclaims God, the altogether highest value, this is a degradation of God's essence. Here, as elsewhere, thinking in values is the greatest blasphemy imaginable against being. In such statements make people think that Heidegger's work is onto-theological. Jean-Paul Sartre describes the ambivalence of value and its obscurity in another way. He writes, its being, that is of value, is to be value, that is not to be being. That's a bit of a convoluted phrase, and he goes on to say that this is what enables us to conceive why value can simultaneously be and not be. Sartre is able to say this because for him, in all cases of lack, value is the lack, so he defines value as a lack. This is consistent with his view that human reality is a lack. But his view of value as the lack is challenged by the possibility of positive value states. These are such as moral satisfaction, love, magnanimity, and a certain sufficiency of value. The postmodernist Michel Foucault also recommends further inquiry into both subjectivity and the notion of care. He encourages us to ask the question, how have I constructed myself as a moral agent? And in asking about the care of the self, he focuses on three major forces of power, truth, and subjectivity. Foucault sees the care of the self resulting from analysis of and negotiation between these competing influences. But this analysis has become political and social rather than focusing on the concept and the subjectivity of value. Further analysis shows that, subsequent to analytic philosophy and phenomenology, postmodernism can also be unexpectedly accused of neglecting value. This begins with Jean-François Lyotard's definition of postmodernism as an incredulity towards meta-narratives. That is, meta-narratives like Marxism, religion, Enlightenment values, and even science. So in this way, postmodernism has also often been described as anti-value. Yet postmodern critiques of the values underlying meaning and purpose are initially easy to agree with. Postmodernists reject human purposes, manifest destiny, and things that are meant to be. And existentialists agree that values are created by choices and purposes cannot be externally imposed. Yet both existentialists and postmodernists are criticised for unrealistically imposing meaning on the world. But postmodernists go further to deny any social or psychological structures underpinning social life. Postmodernism also makes a radical critique or deconstruction of the meaning of language. Jacques Derrida criticized the history of philosophy as logocentric, implying absolute meaning. He held that meaning of the text is undecidable and that language is subjective. Postmodernists hold that there is no fixed intrinsic meaning to text and that meaning is attributed to the reader. They will not privilege or value the meaning attributed by the author over the reader. For example, Paul Ricoeur describes an author as the first reader. So on this view, scripture, constitutions and statute laws are open to different and equally valid interpretations. On a postmodernist view, we can say then that the meaning of the text is a relative value judgment. That is, the text is not only open to interpretation, but to radical interpretation almost without limit. This seems to be implausible, especially with factual or scientific texts. The problem for postmodernism is their rejection of what they call privilege, that we can call value preference. But against this view, interpretation takes place in context with set boundaries of meaning and understanding. The postmodern view of science seems to be the most untenable, especially that of Paul Feyerabend. At his most extreme, Feyerabend described science as epistemological anarchy and that anything goes. And he held that acquisition of scientific knowledge isn't governed by universal rules or method. But against this view, the limits of scientific knowledge already has had a long and more moderate history. That is, in the self-critical nature of science, as well as the method of doubt in Descartes, Leibniz, Hume and others. Yet in Feyerabend's defence, he claims to criticise the supposedly unique status of scientific fact. He writes, "My criticism of modern science is that it inhibits freedom of thought. But that, I think, depends on whether we see science as all-embracing or as an aspect of knowledge." With respect to ethics, the problem for postmodernism is rejection of objective moral principles and universal human values. For example, Zygmunt Bauman speaks of a rejection of the search for absolutes, universals and foundations. And Adam Phillips states that the universal moral principles must be eradicated. These are to be replaced with local and situational responses of individual uniqueness. This is a feature that we paradoxically find in the covert postmodernism of Jordan Peterson. The problem for postmodernism is that without ethical values or principles, we can't construct an ethic. There are many criticisms of postmodernism, such as Jürgen Habermas's critique of reflexivity. That is, postmodernists employ analytic and linguistic critiques that only modern reason can provide. But my criticism of postmodernism is their refusal to refer to any normative values at all, and their rejection of structures of consciousness denies them that access to value. But in contrast to both analytic philosophy and postmodernism, the significance of value can be seen in the fundamental, indeed all activities of life. In religion, God is the believer's highest value. A meaningful life is worthwhile and lit up by value. Ethical principles are values that guide our actions. Yet it's a remarkable fact that we have no theory of value as a principle of ethics or meaning. Happiness has been formulated as a principle of ethics in utilitarianism. Reason and duty have been formulated as principles in Kantian ethics. Character has been formulated as a principle of ethics in Aristotle's virtue theory ethics. But value itself, as the major principle of ethics, is missing from the lexicon of moral philosophy. I hope to have mitigated this deficit by presenting a value theory of ethics related to virtue theory ethics. Yet by looking back in history, again to religion, we can see the development of ideas such as value. and notably the length of time it has been overlooked in history indicates its degree of obscurity. And as just noted, we can see that religion is overwhelmingly a long-standing system of value. But religions don't typically have theories of value or recognize motives of meaning or purpose. This would plunge them into explicit understanding which would undermine religious reality. Yet, of course, many Christian scholars have theorized about the nature of value, but the value theory of Thomas Aquinas frequently focused on economic and political thought. This view of value was grounded on the issues of private property and voluntary exchange. And in 1776, Etienne Bonnot was the first economist not to agree with such an objective or utility value theory. He considered that both value and utility have a psychological substrate and result from individual interest. Neglect of value in the ancient religious world might have been thought rectified in ancient Greek and Aristotelian thought. But despite the renewal of Aristotle's virtue theory, it lacked a number of ideas about the concept of value. Karl Marx may have overstated the point in saying that Aristotle had no concept of value, yet Aristotelian virtue is nevertheless a matter of character and inclination rather than value, and these virtues omit the Kantian moral features of goodwill and intention. In addition to these omissions, we can also say that Aristotelian ethics didn't give prominence to the value of people as ends in themselves. It also accepted naturalistic ideals without demur and was blind to the fact-value problem. Virtue ethics also neglected executive virtues such as goodwill and self-esteem, which didn't imply direct action. And with respect to the definition of physical or other objects, Aristotle fallaciously attributed the property of purpose, which is a value state, to physical objects. In the modern world, we don't define objects in such a way by their essence or purpose, but by their overt characteristic like length, depth, density, etc. In a similar criticism of Aristotle, Elizabeth Anscombe tells us in her work Modern Moral Philosophy that the term moral itself just doesn't seem to fit in its modern sense into an account of Aristotelian ethics, because Anscombe tells us it lacks the concept of the moral sense of ought. Alistair MacIntyre elaborates on these points and informs us that in Latin, as in Greek, there is no word correctly translated by our word moral. Cicero invented moralis to translate the Greek word ethikos, meaning pertaining to character. Yet since the Renaissance and in modern times, value has also been neglected in ethics. For Kant, inclination is amoral, and he regarded feeling as almost pathological. Kant's morals was instead determined by reason, universalization, volition and duty. Similarly, for Spinoza, virtue was the power and the clarity of reason over passion, emotion and feeling. Conversely, Hume believed in the priority and feeling and held that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. But his discovery of distinguishing ought from a factual is was hardly recognised in his day. Hume later wrote of his treatise, where the is-ought distinction is recorded, that it fell dead-born from the press. G.E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy is often thought to provide a proof of Hume's principle. That is, Moore argued that there was a persistent confusion between the moral good and natural states like desirable. The naturalistic fallacy is the identification of moral values with natural or non-conscious properties. Moore claimed that such oversight could be found in practically every ethical theory, and this underlines the idea of error and neglect concerning the concept of value. This neglect is echoed in the early 19th century by Charles Gray Shaw. He states that value as a principle of ethics has been overlooked by both ancient and modern philosophy. Barry Maguire endorses this neglect of value in writing about, I quote, the promising but surprisingly overlooked value-based theory of reasons. This claim may seem contentious given the large number of books available that focus on ethics and value, but the concept of value in these works is largely an unidentified placeholder or just applications of value. That is, applications of value like ethical, economic, aesthetic, family, religious and scientific values. Analyses of the inherent character or structure of value are surprisingly hard to find. I myself hope to define value with internal features like subjectivity, preference and quality. But there is another meaning of the idea of the value as a principle of ethics, i.e. it's not just the concept of value common to all theories of ethics, but it is a principle of ethics that is a moral imperative and overriding guiding principle. And I advocate such a principle of ethics as the principle of a value theory ethics. I explicate this theory in another workshop, but we can nevertheless comment on it now. To explain, all ethical principles are values that guide moral actions, values like utility, duty and character. But value as a principle of ethics or a value theory ethics is employed in a different way. To show this, we can compare and contrast another theory of ethics, say utilitarianism, with a value theory ethics. The guiding principle of utilitarianism is utility, or the maximization of the affect state of happiness. The principle of utility is thereby a guiding value, and happiness is valued as an objective. The objectives and outcomes of utilitarianism are affect states like happiness and pleasure. But on a value theory of ethics, value itself is the guiding principle and its objectives are value states. Value states necessarily instantiate values, states like love, courage, moral fortitude and magnanimity. And the guiding principle of a value theory ethics would be to value value, or the will to value. The argument and justification of this principle is again the subject of another workshop. So I conclude by pointing to both a historical and contemporary neglect of the concept of value, not least in ethics. This leads us to the suspicion that something important has been overlooked. That is, the possibility of a value theory ethics not accounted for by previous theories of ethics. Yet more than this, my overriding concern is wider than that of ethics. I'm concerned with the role of value in meaning, purpose and human experiences yet to be discovered. These topics are examined in my other workshops and inquiries. Yet I have argued here against the intuitive view that we have always had an explicit grasp of the concept of value. I began by arguing this view, showing that the concept of value is much more disparate than we thought, and similarly that the phenomenon of value is subjective, not objective as often believed. We then trace the origins of the neglect of value through science and analytic philosophy, and even unexpectedly through phenomenology, existentialism and postmodernism. With respect to postmodernism, I propose that their key concept of the rejection of privilege isn't so much a rejection of bias, but it is an unsubstantiated rejection of preference that is at the foundations of value. Paradoxically, even ancient and modern ethics have neglected their key underlying concept of value. And this again raises the suspicion again that something important has been overlooked. And in my view, what has been overlooked is value as a principle of ethics, meaning, purpose and life. So let me have your criticisms and comments at the meeting or on the meetup or YouTube internet pages.